In 2025, you could be easily confused by everything you're seeing. You might listen to the anti-fragile group and think that any technique is going to work for you. Or you might look at the technique perfectionist group and think that any deviation away from perfect technique is going to kill you. Sometimes there's this fallacy of a lifter presented who never increases the weight on the barbell because they think their technique is going to degrade so much they're going to hurt themselves. There's made out to be some kind of endemic of people who are totally afraid of adding weight. Now, these people might exist, but I can tell you from a lot of evidence from seeing literally tens of thousands of athletes in terms of strength training, weightlifting, powerlifting, that 99% of those have something they could work on. The way we see it, there's two main concerns you should have around strength training when it comes to your technique and weight on the barbell. The first is not injury risk, but actually performance. Now, you probably should have expected that coming from a sports performance channel. Injury risk is a concern, but it's not our first concern when it comes to technique. Technique undoubtedly matters for heavier weights, no matter what anyone tells you. And it might even work for you now with your current weights, but if you add 10 or 20 kilos, you might suddenly expose an area that you didn't know was an issue. Sometimes there's this, what we consider a fallacy presented, that your best technique is the one that you use at heavier weights. So if your heavy maxes suddenly degrade in technique, if you hit certain forms that might not be considered ideal, some people might present these as the best way that you can lift this. This is the way your body is finding a way to lift this weight. But we expressly disagree with that view. The goal isn't to survive a lift and just make this max lift. It's to make the lift make the most sense in terms of your training. Falling back to secondary positions isn't a skill, it's a bad habit, and there's no reason you should be justifying it. So let's bust a myth for a second here and understand that you can improve technique while you move through the program. So this is the common idea presented, or the fear that some lifters have, is that when you're in the middle of a program, it's too late to make adjustments. So as the weights are increasing, there's this idea from some people that this is a bad time to make these corrections. Don't have this fear. We've seen loads of lifters make corrections from small to medium-sized adjustments to their technique as they progress through a program. Now, in some cases, are technical adjustments so large and so egregious that you need to stop the program and make a change? Absolutely. But for most people, most of their changes can be made for most of the program. There will come a point in your program where you're too close to the end to make any meaningful changes. Some of this is technical and a physical adaptation, but also some of this is purely a psychological change. When we're going for a max attempt, we don't want to be making absolutely enormous technical adjustments when we're going for heavy sessions. There does come a day where some lifters do need to actually regress the weight on the barbell just for a little bit. But for a lot of you watching this, I know for a fact that while you're running a program, you can improve your technique. The second concern, and probably the main one a lot of people have around technique and strength training, is injury risk. You might have even seen some people or studies saying, for example, that the technique you use on lifts doesn't matter. What really matters is the stimulus you're providing to your body, and as a result, your body will adapt to this. So whatever technique you might use in heavier weights is probably the one you should use all the time, and as a result, you will adapt. This is where we believe good technique comes into its own. We believe it follows these two key areas in a really reliable fashion. The first area is we believe that there's inherently a better way of doing the squat, bench, and deadlift. We believe there's a certain technique that applies to most people in most scenarios. The second area we believe is to follow the principles of good load management, and the fact that if consistency is the name of the game, we believe that good technique is something that is in general easier to follow, both psychologically from the fact that you have a playbook, and physiologically once you learn the principles of good technique. So why not do something that allows you to lift more weight and to potentially minimize the risk of your injury? If it's to be consistent, you might as well be consistent with good technique.
One of the best areas we can see increases in performance with our technique is bar placement during the back squat. Now, we've been sold a small lie in terms of strength training and bar positioning for our squats, and that is it's either high bar for very quad dominant and super upright squats, or it's in a low bar position for very posterior dominant and low bar style squats. When you run your hand across the back of your shoulder, you'll feel this bony process. This is called the acromion process. It doesn't really matter what it's called though. All I want you to do is run the hand across the flat of your back until you feel this bony process coming up. This process should sit basically at the widest point of your back, and it's going to form the target for where the barbell should sit during this mid-bar style back squat. Essentially what we do when we move the barbell's position on our back is change where it sits over our base of support. This in turn leads leads to the squats looking very different, one being very upright and one being very bent over. But this is all a very small manipulation with where that barbell sits over that base of support. If we want to get the most optimized squat technique possible, we need to start slowly and incrementally changing the barbell's position so it suits our own lever lengths absolutely perfectly and gives us the most efficient motor pattern possible. For those lifters blessed with short femurs and very long spines, a high bar position won't necessarily negatively affect them too much. Their femurs are very short, so when their hips go back, it doesn't put them through a large arcing range of motion, and so they're able to keep that very high bar position with a very upright torso. Now, if you're somebody with longer legs and a shorter back, the arc you're going to move through with your hips is going to be significantly bigger, and once our hips start getting pushed back more, our torso will have to lean forward to keep that barbell over our base of support. With all of this being said, what does that mean for you? For most lifters, that acromion process on the back of our shoulders is going to be a great compromise between having an upright squat position, thus training the quads, the glutes, the hips, the backs, all with the perfect amount of bias, without necessarily having to force us to have massive heel raises or force us to have incredible ankle range of motion to keep those knees pushed forward, thus keeping the hips pushed forward and that barbell over the base of support. There will undoubtedly be exceptions to this rule. There will be some people with incredibly long or short legs which will have to have that barbell higher or lower on their backs, but for most of us, we're not going to be in that snowflake position, and thus this mid-bar position is going to serve us very well. Another excellent area to look for these kind of biomechanical efficiencies is in the bench press. Many things people think about in the bench press have to do with limiting range of motion. So whether it's a wider grip or a bigger arch as I lay on the bench, people will tend to think that's the first thing we should try and do with our bench in order to increase that 1RM as high as possible. These kind of technical manipulations are certainly valuable at a certain point in our training cycle or a certain point in our training career. But what I really want you to think about for the bench press, as with the other exercises, is what's the best technique to use to get the best training effect, and let's worry about competition performance afterwards. When we're bench pressing, the number one thing I'm going to look for in the bottom position is my forearm angle. Keeping that wrist stacked over my elbow is hugely important. If I start to tuck my elbows in too much, the weight of the barbell will force my shoulder into external rotation. External rotation is a very poor position to be in if I'm trying to press the most amount of weight possible. This is actually akin to a key lock position or an Americana for those of us in grappling sports. This position of tucked elbows, as I'm forcing up against it, it's going to put a huge amount of pressure on my rotator cuff and won't allow me to press the most weight I can. Likewise, if I start to flare my elbows outwards and go to a more pec dominant position, that barbell is now forcing my shoulder into internal rotation. Internal rotation, likewise, is not the best position for me to be pressing in, and so I always want to make sure that in this plane, my forearm is vertical to the floor. Likewise, when we're looking in the other plane, I want to make sure this forearm is staying vertical throughout as well. This is going to be particularly important when we start adjusting our grip width. If Owen is pressing with a good grip width, this forearm will stay vertical throughout the entire press, never forcing that internal or external rotation on the shoulders. But when we start widening our grip out to more of the competition style press now, you'll see Owen's forearm starts to slowly deviate out to the side. Many people will fight against this by flaring their elbows slightly to try and get that forearm into a more vertical position, but it's very difficult and puts an awful lot more pressure on his pecs. If Owen now narrows his grip and brings his grip into that bodybuilding style close grip bench press, you see it's quite difficult for him to maintain that vertical forearm in the bottom position. When we do this, he'll have to recruit an awful lot more lats to keep that elbow squeezed in underneath his arm, and particularly for those of you who have quite jacked upper bodies, that squeezing of the lats is going to be quite difficult due to a phenomenon known as biomechanical stacking. Biomechanical stacking is the physiological phenomenon where we have increased proprioceptive awareness due to the fact that one part of our body is touching off another. We're no longer relying solely on things like muscle spindles and Golgi apparatus to tell us where our arm is in relation to our body, but rather we have that proprioceptive awareness coming from the skin touching off another part of our body. Biomechanical stacking can be a great thing if we're looking to lift the most weights possible, but I want you to stay aware of it as you start manipulating these small technical aspects of your lift. If you suddenly start forcing your arms into that position and it's hard to maintain them in that plane as you go throughout the press, I want you to be aware that biomechanical stacking could be the thing getting in the way. Also, if you're struggling to maintain stability throughout the lift, maybe think of biomechanical stacking once again and try and pin your arms in a small bit more and be more aware of the feeling that's in your armpit or your lats as you go throughout the bench press. So we've talked about the back squat and optimizing those back squat positions, forcing our torso to stay in the optimal position throughout by manipulating where the barbell sits on our back. In the bench press, we talked about changing the width of our grip to make sure our arm stays in the best position possible and optimizing all of those muscle groups we'll use throughout. And so, of course, the next logical step for us to talk about will be optimizing our deadlift positions to make sure I'm using the best technique possible to lift the most weight most consistently. When we look to optimize positions in the deadlift, very few things are going to give us more bang for our buck than manipulating our start position and how we initiate the first pull. The first pull in the deadlift brings the bar from its starting position on the floor to passing our kneecap. The main manipulation we'll have here is our relative torso angle to the floor. In the ideal position, we have shins in an almost vertical position, knees slightly in advance of the barbell, and my hips are significantly above the line of my kneecap. There are two non-ideal or secondary positions we'll commonly see people using here. The first of these non-ideal positions is the back dominant deadlift start. What does this look like? In most cases, this will look like my hips being almost at the same level of my shoulders far in advance of the barbell when we look from the side, and my shins being almost vertical to the floor. This can be a really useful position if I'm just trying to train my hamstrings, glutes, or back, but if I want to optimize the level of performance I get from the deadlift, thus increasing the overall 1RM and getting a more well-rounded training effect, I shouldn't have my hips quite so high. The second of these non-ideal positions then is the opposite of the first case. This is hips far too low, shoulders back behind the level of the barbell, and knees forward and in advance of the bar. This leads to me essentially squatting the barbell up. Why do we not like this position? Oftentimes we'll hear people talking about using their legs when they're lifting from the floor, but in the deadlift itself, it's really not the optimal case. The first reason here is that the barbell will have to loop out and around the level of my knees in order to get up to my hips. The second reason is that I'm really closing off the amount of muscle I'm using. My quads are obviously big, powerful muscle groups, but they're not as powerful as the combination of my quads, hamstrings, glutes, and back. So if I wanted to get the best deadlift possible, I want to make sure I'm using all of those muscle groups while ensuring I'm moving through good ranges of motion. So what does this optimal deadlift position look like? Well, let's start at the ground and move upwards. Starting firstly with the shins and the knees. The knees should be over and maybe slightly in advance of the barbell, but they shouldn't be so far over the bar that I'm having to loop the bar out during the first pull. My hips then should start significantly above the level of my knees, but nowhere near the level of my shoulders. For most people, this will look like roughly a 45-degree angle of the torso in relation to the floor. Finally then, my shoulders should be on top of or maybe slightly in advance of the barbell, and they should be pulled back in a strong starting position. This will give you the best all-round position with which you can lift the most weight, the most effectively, and the most consistently.
Look, we understand that good technique isn't always easy to have, but this is a meritocracy. That's the best part about strength sports, and you understand that. It's probably one of the main reasons you do it. Strength sports are something that if you put in the effort, there's a good chance you'll get a good result. So just because bad technique feels easier in the short term doesn't mean it's something you need to adhere to. Don't give yourself excuses. It can seem a little bit complicated, but I promise you, once you figure this out, it's more about repetition than discovery of new aspects. Check out the link below. 30 days of strength training. It's some of our biggest insights into strength training. They'll send you one email a day for 30 days and you won't regret it.